Hello and welcome to another edition, an emergency edition, no less, of the Sibylline Insights podcast. I'm delighted today to be welcoming Megan Sutcliffe from our Middle East and Africa desk and Lewis Galvin for his inaugural Sibylline pod from our Americas desk. I'm Gareth Westwood, Head of Global Intelligence, and over the weekend we've learned that there are to be renewed talks between US and Iran, specifically regarding the nuclear deal. Now, these are set to take place as we're recording it in a few days' time. This has actually been recorded on Wednesday, the 16th of April. So if there's been any major developments between the talks taking place and you hearing this, we will, of course, update you via our reporting. So if you are listening to this after the talks have taken place, week beginning 21st of April onwards, do get in touch with us for an update. The desks will be reporting on any developments. But as I said, we are recording this on Wednesday the 16th, just a few days before these talks are meant to take place. Now, before we delve into the talks, I think it's worthwhile just putting this in some context, an explainer, you might call it. So to that end, Megan, can you give us a quick rundown of where we are, maybe touch on the JCPOA and the context of these talks?
Absolutely, and thank you for having us on the podcast today, Gareth. So on the 12th of April, we saw Iran and the United States engaging in nuclear talks in Oman's capital, Muscat. This was one of the highest level engagements between Iranian representatives and US representatives on any matter, not least on nuclear negotiations and possible agreement to limit Iran's nuclear development program and capabilities. This marks the highest level engagement since 2015, which was indeed when we saw Iran and the United States and several other parties signing the JCPOA. This agreement was a landmark treaty that concerned Iran's nuclear program and that really centered on three main aspects that limited Iran's ability to quickly develop a nuclear weapon, delaying its so-called breakout time to a goal of about 12 months. Now, this agreement effectively did three things. Firstly, it aimed to reduce Iran's stockpiles of enriched uranium, partially by reducing the extent to which it enriched uranium, but also by limiting its work on uranium or indeed plutonium metals and its alloys. The agreement also limited Iran's use of its centrifuges, the technology that is central to enriching uranium, to the extent that it could be used for a variety of purposes, whether those are civilian energy generation, medical purposes, or indeed the development of a nuclear arsenal. And finally, the agreement substantially increased international observation and monitoring of Iran's nuclear activities. This was a major deal and resulted in major sanctions relief from Iran, but it was not without controversy. And indeed, because of that, we saw US President Donald Trump pulling the US out of the agreement during his first term in 2018.
Thank you, Megan. And, we are having this emergency pod partially due to demand from clients and partners and friends who are, Lewis, a little bit confused about this. And the question we get asked is, despite all the rhetoric of the new Trump administration over the last few months, this was the last thing that some of them was expecting to happen. So from the US standpoint, then, why engage now? What's the purpose?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Gareth. I think I can certainly understand why there might be some confusion about why this is now seemingly top of Trump's agenda. And I think there are at least sort of three key factors that are feeding into why the US is negotiating now. I think first and foremost, during the first Trump administration, we saw the president really seek diplomatic victories, particularly on the international stage. At the moment, progress to attempt to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, for example, has been stalling, or there have been no sort of measurable victories so far. So I think the Middle East provides an opportunity for Trump to try and, achieve one of those geopolitical victories. He was very critical of the Biden administration's handling of the wider conflict involving Israel, Hamas, and Iranian proxies in the region. And therefore, I think this presents an opportunity for the Trump administration to demonstrate some strength and to make some, meaningful headway into resolving the wider situation. So essentially, this is giving the administration an opportunity to demonstrate Trump's skills as a peacemaker. That is an effort that he's attempting across the broader international stage, but in particular, the Middle East is something that he has always valued, or at least resolving conflicts in the Middle East is something that Trump has always valued. We saw that during the first administration. Development of things like the Abraham Accords were something he really prided himself on, and the administration prided itself on. So I think it's another opportunity for Trump to demonstrate himself or portray himself as that peacemaker. I think one of the other key factors as well is that the US intelligence community has been issuing some comments over the last couple of months relating to Iran's nuclear program. So notably, the perception within the community is that Iran has shortened its time frame to develop a nuclear bomb to around 10 to 15 days, which is a considerably shortened time frame from what was recently assumed sort of mid to late 2024. That's not to say that the Iranians will be able to develop a nuclear weapon within that time frame, which I think is an important distinction to make. That is still, a longer term process. It requires developing, missile or weapons delivery systems, etc. But the fact that Iran it is believed to have been able to shorten that time frame is really significant from the US, and I imagine a point of concern for the Trump administration. In sort of tangent with that is that the intelligence community believes Iran is investigating pathways to develop a crude nuclear weapon within a shorter time frame. So they're looking at a sort of 6-month period to develop a crude, so not a sophisticated nuclear weapon, but a more crude delivery system. And again, I think the perception that Iran is pursuing those aims is a real point of concern, and that is what is driving Trump to start these negotiations.
Thank you. And Megan, the US sees an opportunity here, and maybe a diplomatic opportunity, and of course the rather worrying developments in terms of the nuclear ambitions. A couple of things. What does Iran stand to gain from this? And as a kind of a side question to that, do we think that Israel were involved in not pressuring the US, but in the conversation in terms of the resumption of these talks, or were Israel kept out of the loop? So 2 things there. What does Iran stand to gain? And just a really quick one on the Israel piece.
Well, there are major potential benefits for Iran if we were to see a successful engagement with the United States and the possible signature of an agreement. Iran is seeking major sanctions concessions, and since President Donald Trump came into office once again, we've seen a resumption of his maximum pressure campaign. Now, this is manifested in many ways, but primarily focuses on the expansion and the rigorous enforcement of sanctions on Iran's economy and its key exports, particularly paired with Trump's rhetoric around China, which is one of Iran's largest crude purchasers. There is significant concern within Iran that the maximum pressure campaign will not just be a danger to its economic lifelines, but it will be deleterious. It's worth also noting that Iran has been through a period over the past few years of substantial protest after the death of Mahsa Amini in morality police custody in 2022. We saw major protests from a variety of anti-government civil society groups in Iran, and this was a major blow to the prestige of the regime internally. It really galvanized a lot of anti-government support and sentiment. And so Iran at present is likely very nervous about what the impact of the economic pressure stepping from the maximum pressure campaign will have on its domestic dynamics. The dynamic with Israel is also one that will certainly have weighed on Iran's decision-making process when it comes to having decided to engage in these negotiations, and will certainly be influencing how the US is approaching this particular dynamic. Over the past few months, we have seen major changes in the region stemming from Israeli military action. We have seen major blows to Hezbollah's capability in Lebanon, Hezbollah was one of Iran's most prominent proxies, was often referred to as its jewel in the crown of regional allied groups and proxy forces. And so the significant damage that it was dealt during the Israel-Hezbollah war, that will have influenced Iran's perception of its ability to threaten Israel and deter significantly potential Israeli or US strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Following the signature of the Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire, we also saw the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. This has significantly limited Iran's ability to resupply and support Hezbollah as it attempts to reconstitute itself, as well as reducing another angle through which it could pressure Israel and deter it from striking its nuclear facilities. Therefore, it's understandable why Iran would now be engaging in negotiations with the United States, because of the fact that it is significantly concerned about its economic prospects and what that would mean for domestic stability, but also because it worries that it no longer has the effective deterrent against potential Israeli participation in a US strike action targeting its nuclear facilities. All in all, it likely sees Trump's threats regarding economic pressure and direct action as being far more credible and therefore far more concerning.
Thank you, Megan. And Lewis, what does Trump go in on here? We've seen, his sometimes quite unique negotiating style, maximal pressure. What do you think their opening gambit could be this weekend and in follow-up talks after that?
Yeah, so I think the Trump administration on the international stage since his inauguration in January his approach has been one of coming out of the blocks fast, making the most serious of threats against adversaries. In this case, with Iran, as the rhetoric started to heat up several weeks ago, there were threats of direct strikes on Tehran. That has since been slightly scaled back to Trump alluding to strikes on nuclear facilities. So I think that's just a demonstration that the Trump administration is always going to start with the most severe consequences as a threat. That's going to draw these partners or these countries to the negotiating table. And from there on, more meaningful developments can take place. I think there's a clear willingness from the Trump administration to enter negotiations. Otherwise, they wouldn't be entertaining these talks in Oman, for example. And that is despite the fact that both sides, both Iran and the US, have set out red lines, which on the face of it might not be particularly compatible. However, I think the Trump rhetoric is to draw around to the negotiating table because there's a suggestion that some kind of compromise can be made. I think the red lines for the US that won't change is that Iran will be required to eradicate weaponization programs with relation to its nuclear program. I think that is a red line that will certainly persist throughout these negotiations. And I think the real sticking point between both sides that the US is seeking to address is the level of enrichment that it is willing to allow Tehran to persist with. So, of course, the Iranian regime claims that its program is for civilian purposes, but the US perspective is that between 60 and 90% enrichment isn't necessary for a civilian nuclear program. Stephen Witkoff recently alluded to a willingness on the US perspective to return to the 3.67% enrichment target, which is broadly accepted to be an enrichment percentage to facilitate a civilian nuclear program. And therefore, up to 60% is clearly in excess of that target. So although recent comments have come out of the US administration that it would require a complete eradication of the nuclear program, even for, civilian processes, I think, again, that's part of the negotiating tool. It's starting with the most serious of demands, but that will be a point of negotiation. That being said, I do predict throughout the coming weeks and months as these negotiations are going on that the rhetoric about US military action is going to persist. Trump is going to be very public and his administration are going to be very public about these demands and these threats to be seen to be sort of strong-arming Tehran to continue with its negotiations. There have been some measures as well to indicate that there is an increasing US presence in the region. Of course, in mid-2024, a naval strike group with the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier was deployed. that has been conducting strikes on Houthi positions in Yemen. And in fact, the Truman was recently joined by a second aircraft carrier and associated strike group, the USS Carl Vinson. So there is a clear appetite within the US that if negotiations don't go a certain way, that military action is still on the table. But I think we are going to see stepping stones before we get to that point. And these negotiations are going to be a key indicator in how that develops. As well, just to wrap up on that point, Megan, brilliantly mentioned about the maximum pressure strategy. That is always going to persist, I think, in the background alongside these negotiations. Economic pressure is something that the Trump administration is really emphasizing in a broad range of geopolitical theaters, and using things like tariffs or just broader economic pressure on the oil industry, for example, is something that's likely going to really be at the fore of these negotiations as well. Particularly, targeting states which are seen to be collaborating with Iran to evade sanctions, for example. I think the recent global tariff impositions have demonstrated that the Trump administration is willing to target any country with economic measures. So I think maximum pressure is also going to persist as a key theme throughout these negotiations.
Megan, that is a drastic demand to decrease from, up to 60% enrichment, all the way down to those very low numbers that constitutes an acceptable, civilian program. Is that likely to be a red line? Do Iran have any red lines? And, how much can we trust the Iranian regime to abide by any negotiated enrichment levels or any other part of a deal that Donald Trump could strike, given that, policing this would involve international agencies, right? Those international agencies that, the US administration seems so skeptical about. That's another matter. So what are the red lines, Megan? Is this going to be realistic, or are the Iranian regime out to play the US?
Absolutely, Gareth. And just as Lewis has highlighted from the US side that there will likely be a strong opening position from negotiating parties, we're likely to see a similar rhetoric from Iran, particularly regarding red lines. We know that frequently Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, has said that Iran will not completely dismantle its nuclear program, and it has shown significant resistance to any form of negotiation that would hinge on a complete dismantlement. Iran, as Lewis said, has consistently stated that its nuclear program is for entirely civilian purposes. And so a complete dismantlement is something it's highly unlikely to agree to. However, given that the JCPOA was effectively an agreement that did bring that enrichment level down to 3.67%, it is possible that Iran would agree to this again, even though we have seen enrichment up to 60%, that of course drastically decreases breakout time for the development of a nuclear warhead. I think, though, the issue here will be just how many concessions the United States seeks when it comes to the other aspects of the JCPOA or a JCPOA style agreement, as well as regarding Iran's role in the broader region. Although Iran may well concede to decreasing its uranium enrichment levels, possibly paring back some of its more advanced capabilities, it's very challenging to assess whether or not Iran would have a willingness to engage in, say, reducing its stockpiles, as well as dismantling its more advanced centrifuges, for example, or potentially decreasing its stocks of non-advanced centrifuges, ones that are seen as being relatively standard, that are part of what one could deem to be a civil nuclear program. It's also worth noting that, of course, one of the concerns the United States and international parties have about Iran's nuclear program is the possibility of some form of nuclear proliferation, particularly a dirty bomb or some kind of unadvanced munition being distributed to Iran's proxies. It's therefore possible that we will see some rhetoric from the United States regarding Iran reducing its support for certain proxies. it's highly unlikely that Iran is going to make major concessions in this area, particularly when it comes to key proxy allies such as Hezbollah or various factions that are active in Iraq. Depending on just how intense the rhetoric is from the United States over the next few weeks and exactly how much they demand in terms of scaling back Iran's capabilities and its relations with its proxies, then we may be getting to a point at which Iran decides that it has reached its red lines for engagement.
So, Lewis, as Megan pointed out, the Iranians are very proud of their nuclear program, and support to proxies in the region has really underlined the Iranian regime's foreign policy since the revolution. So Trump's maximalist approach is unlikely to yield significant success in terms of full concessions from the Iranians, and I could be proved wrong. So please do keep in touch with Sibylline and abreast of our reporting and developments. But as we stand now, we think it's pretty unlikely that there'll be any maximalist concessions made by the Iranians, particularly when they have allies internationally, both in the region, and whilst their proxies might be diminished, they do have allies in the likes of Russia and to a certain extent China. So my question to you is, after this weekend, should Iran fail to make major concessions during, the opening gambit, round one, will, the US administration give up there and then? Or do we see there being an enduring diplomatic effort and a negotiations strategy that might be somewhat more measured than what we've seen in the first 3 months, for example, of the new administration?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gareth. And I think first and foremost, the Trump administration is certainly not going to want to be seen as withdrawing from negotiations. The perception that it's perhaps failed to meet targets to come to an agreement, I think is likely going to continue to push, the diplomatic route in the longer term. However, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, I think that's going to run parallel to the rhetoric of military action as the key leveraging tool that the US has. I think the conclusion of the upcoming round of negotiations, I don't think there's a requirement for both sides to come to an agreement. I think, if anything, that's actually unexpected, quite unexpected. But I don't think that should be perceived as a failure. I think the fact that both sides are at the negotiating table for a second round of talks, despite all of the rhetoric and the tit for tat, demonstrates that they are both willing to come to a compromise. That's going to be in the longer term. Now, if the Trump administration perceives that this second round of talks has been a complete failure, if Iran doesn't appear to be moving from any of its red lines, and that's completely incompatible with the United States' red lines, then I do think we will start to see an escalation of some of those points that I mentioned earlier. Maximum pressure, economic sanctions on trading partners, those allies to Tehran that you mentioned, Russia, China as the notable ones. We've got increasing pressure on Venezuela. Of course, there's oil coming out of Venezuela that is often reported to be heading to Iran as well. So I think maximum pressure is going to be the first and foremost response that the United States conducts. And that could also be conducted in tandem with regional military action. I wouldn't go as far at this stage to say that is going to be strikes on Tehran. I think that is much further down the line. That has to be a lot more failed negotiations than, the initial preliminary talks that we're seeing now. What we could see is an escalation in targeted attacks on those Iranian proxies. We're already seeing one of those naval strike groups, the Truman Strike Group, in the region targeting the Houthis in Yemen. And so that, I think, would be the next natural stepping stone, would be an increase in that type of military action rather than directly targeting Iran. But as I said, I think nobody is expecting a measurable conclusion from this round of talks. It is going to be a longer term process, but I don't think that necessarily means that either side will consider that to be a failure.
Thanks, Lewis. And you preempted my kind of final question there, which is great, on the indicators, warnings, the triggers of potential progress, success, or indeed the breakdown of talks. Megan, what will we expect to see in the region as an indicator of success or failure as these talks progress?
Well, this certainly, as Lewis has said, is going to be a long road. It took almost, I believe, 20 months for the JCPOA to be negotiated. So it's unlikely that we would see major progress towards a comprehensive agreement in the very short term. But that being said, there are indicators we can look to that would point to a positive flavour to the ongoing engagements. Firstly, continued negotiations between delegations, potentially not as high level as the ones that we saw meeting in Oman last week, particularly through back channels, for example. Continued engagement would indicate that there is positive progress being made. It's also worth noting that it's possible we would see progress towards more of an interim agreement over the next few months. This is not unprecedented. We saw the JCPOA signatories signing an interim agreement that resulted in temporary sanction suspension or freezing in 2013, a year and a half before the JCPOA was signed. So it's possible that that would be another indicator that things are progressing well if we see some kind of memorandum of understanding or an interim agreement being made. It's worth watching as well the actions of IAEA monitors and whether or not they are granted access to Iranian nuclear facilities. This would be a demonstration of goodwill from the Iranian regime, and so it is possible that it's something that will develop or increase in frequency over the coming months, particularly given the relative standstill that we've seen in allowing international observers to monitor Iranian nuclear capacities since 2023. A key deadline when it comes to these negotiations will be October of 2025, as this is when the JCPOA and certain clauses, specifically its snapback clauses, will expire. These clauses essentially make it far more simple for signatories to reapply UN sanctions on Iran if it's perceived to be violating the agreement. This is also partly one of the factors that has put as much pressure on these negotiations as has been expressed over the past few months. There's a concern from the US's side that if the agreement expires, then Russia or China will veto efforts to re-sanction Iran without the snapback mechanism being in place. From Iran's perspective, they're very concerned that because of this worry that it will be harder to sanction Iran in the long term, that current signatories, namely the EU, Germany and the UK, will attempt to engage these clauses before the expiry of the deal, so in the coming months. So it would be very important to watch exactly how discussions about sanctions and about the snapback clause change and develop over the next few months. Finally, one factor to certainly watch is Israel. Israel has a significant ability to act as a spoiler in these negotiations. We know that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has frequently opposed the idea of diplomatic engagement between the US and Iran, and has only said he would see it as being a good thing if it results in the rapid paring back of Iranian nuclear capabilities. If we see Israel significantly escalating its rhetoric, particularly regarding its possible participation in military strikes targeting Iran, this is something that could well undermine trust and make these negotiations thornier in the long term, delaying any potential outcomes and compounding that pressure stemming from the variety of economic and political inputs into this fragile equation.
Thank you. I think, there's a lot there to think about. We are just a final point. We are going to be reporting on this in the coming weeks, no doubt. Iran, the Middle East will form part of our mid-year forecast as well, which is coming up later in the summer. And we, have a wide portfolio of routine and ad hoc reporting that will draw on developments as they pan out. But for now, I think we've covered it pretty comprehensively. Very intrigued what we'll see on in the coming days. And as I said, anyone out there that does want to get access to our reporting or are interested in any more webinars and podcasts, please do reach out for us at info@sibylline.co.uk. That is, I believe, going to be in the show notes or in the caption. So please do get in touch and we'd be delighted to help you and update you on this very important matter in the Middle East. However, for now, Megan Sutcliffe, Lewis Galvin, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to the next opportunity to speak on this topic. And thank you to you all for joining us for another edition of Sibylline Insights Pod. Please do look out for more Sibylline Insights podcasts, as well as our frequent webinars and our What Just Happened podcast series hosted by Ignacio Ayala. So please do look out for that. Get in touch if you need any help. But for now, have a great day, have a great week, have a wonderful weekend, and we will catch up again soon.